Hello there. Tonight, we are going to Madrid in the early 1800s, a place of polished marble floors, whispering servants, and the kind of royal secrets that no history textbook would dare to touch. Somewhere behind the heavy red curtains of the palace, a child has just been born. His mother prays he'll be strong. His father, well, he mostly wants someone to out-hunt him. But neither of them knows what they've really brought into the world. A boy who will become a king. A king who will become a joke. A joke that history will be too ashamed to laugh at out loud. And tonight, you're going to meet him. But just a heads up, you probably won't survive the wedding night. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And don't forget to comment below where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The boy was born at El Escorial, a grand palace that looked more like a monastery than a nursery. The year was 1784, and Spain, though already wobbling under the weight of lost colonies and fading glories, still dressed its power in gold leaf and incense. Into this ornate labyrinth came Ferdinand, the firstborn son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, a royal child born into a bloodline as blue as the ocean and just as unstable. Here's the thing about royal bloodlines, they tend to loop. By the time Ferdinand arrived, the Spanish Bourbons and Habsburgs had been marrying their cousins' nieces, and sometimes even uncomfortably closer relations for generations. This wasn't out of romance. It was politics. Keep the throne in the family, keep the land, keep the power. But when you twist a family tree into a pretzel, nature starts to protest. Ferdinand was the product of centuries of inbreeding. And nature didn't just protest, it screamed. From the outside, baby Ferdinand looked normal enough. At first, soft skin, bright eyes, a little pouty maybe. But as he grew, so did the whispers. He wasn't as quick as the other royal children. His speech came late. His emotions seemed to tilt sideways, either eerily blank or suddenly volcanic. Servants noticed that he cried more than other boys, and sometimes didn't stop. And the way he walked off balance, a little stiff. The royal tutors were concerned, but they were also paid not to be too concerned. Historians still debate whether Ferdinand suffered from specific congenital disorders linked to his family's incestuous lineage, or whether his abnormalities were mostly psychological, shaped by the suffocating world of the Spanish court. But one thing is agreed upon, something was off, and it was going to get worse. As Ferdinand entered adolescence, something else began to grow, and I do mean physically. It wasn't just his body maturing awkwardly. It was his most private parts that alarmed the court physicians. They examined the young prince with the same reverence and horror usually reserved for holy relics or cursed artifacts. It was, as one doctor noted, of such unnatural proportions and configurations that it defied the rules of anatomy. Thin at the base, grotesquely bulbous at the tip, and long, very long. One likened it to a billiard cue. Another claimed it was closer in size to a leg of lamb than a human appendage. These are not flattering medical metaphors. Let me pause here and assure you, this story isn't just about size. It's about shame. It's about how something that should have been private became public, and how that public shame mutated into cruelty. In the strict court of Spain, where appearance was everything, Ferdinand's abnormality wasn't just a medical problem, it was a social crisis. Rumors began to circulate not just among servants, but among diplomats. Courtiers whispered behind gloved hands. Foreign envoys sent coded letters back to Vienna, to Paris, even to London. They called him El Deformado, the deformed one. Ferdinand began to feel it even before he fully understood it. He was watched, judged, pitied. and sometimes laughed at. And Ferdinand hated being laughed at. This early exposure to mockery left a mark, a thick, angry, boiling mark. He started to see insult everywhere, in the way people bowed, the way they avoided eye contact, the way they smiled too politely. He believed everyone was making fun of him, and honestly, sometimes they were. As a boy, he'd throw tantrums. As a teenager, he'd retaliate. There's a particularly chilling account from the memoirs of a chaplain. A young page had accidentally walked in on Ferdinand while he was dressing. Instead of brushing it off or scolding the boy, Ferdinand ordered the page flogged. Publicly. And then had his family exiled. From Madrid. For a peek. This wasn't just about privacy. It was about punishment. About control. Because Ferdinand couldn't control his body, so he controlled everything else. Let's talk briefly about his parents. Because if you're thinking, did no one intervene? Well, no, not really. His father, Charles IV, was a soft man, more interested in hunting than ruling. He left most affairs of state to his wife and her lover, Manuel de Godoy. Yes, you heard that right. Maria Luisa had an open affair with the man who effectively ran Spain, and young Ferdinand watched it all happen. He grew up in a home where power was mocked, where his father was passive, and where his mother's behavior, especially in such a Catholic court, was scandalous. He watched his mother rule through seduction and manipulation. He saw his father tolerate humiliation. He saw loyalty fail. He saw shame thrive, all this while dealing with a condition no one dared name in public. By the time Ferdinand turned 20, he was already twisted into the shape that would define his reign. Paranoid, bitter, deeply insecure, desperate to prove himself a man in a world that had already made up its mind. And of course, there was the issue of marriage. Because for a prince, marriage isn't a personal choice, it's national policy. And Ferdinand had one job above all: produce an heir. But how do you fulfill your duty to the crown when your body won't cooperate? You'll see, but not yet. Close your eyes. Picture the young prince staring at himself in a polished silver mirror, alone in a chamber lit by candles and shame. Outside, the bells of Madrid chime midnight. The king's heir is preparing for the next chapter of his life. A bride is on her way, and he is terrified. The wedding was, of course, magnificent. Because royal weddings always are. The year was 1802, and Madrid shimmered with candlelight and powdered wigs. Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily arrived draped in pearls and innocence barely out of girlhood, her smile full of shy excitement. She had grown up with fairy tales, stories of princes, castles, destinies, and Ferdinand, whom some supporters still called El Deseado, the Desired One, was supposed to be her happily ever after. He even looked the part from a distance. Ferdinand could, when he wanted, play the charming nobleman. He stood tall, wore tailored coats that flattered his broad chest, and bowed with theatrical elegance. On their wedding day, he smiled. He kissed her hand. He made polite, court-approved jokes about love and fortune. Maria Antonia giggled and glanced at her ladies-in-waiting. Maybe she thought it wouldn't be so bad. Oh, Maria, she had no idea. Now, wedding nights in royal courts were never really private affairs. There were traditions, expectations, witnesses sometimes. But nothing prepared Maria Antonia for what awaited behind the gilded doors of her bedchamber. The first sign that something was off came from Ferdinand's valet, who discreetly approached Maria Antonia's attendants with a list of special preparations. It included a set of peculiar custom-made cushions, bottles of strange-smelling ointments, and instructions that read more like a surgical checklist than romantic foreplay. Maria Antonia, raised in a strictly Catholic household, didn't even know what most of these things were for. Her understanding of marital relations had been filtered through veiled metaphors and blushing nuns. The husband will do his duty, she was told, and you must receive him with grace. That was the extent of her education, and then the door opened. Ferdinand stepped in, and whatever illusion of fairy tale courtship Maria Antonia had clung to shattered with a single glance. Because Ferdinand, now stripped of brocade and formality, revealed the thing he had spent years hiding. The source of the whispers, the monster. Her scream echoed through the palace corridors. One lady-in-waiting later wrote she screamed as though the devil himself had appeared, pointing and sobbing, unable to look away or come closer. Ferdinand's member described in one private physician's notes as a grotesque appendage more befitting a medical museum than a human being was indeed beyond what the sheltered girl had imagined. The shape was unnatural. It curved, twisted, expanded, and pulsed with a fleshy presence that seemed to taunt her from across the bed. It wasn't just the size, it was the abnormality, the way it bent, the thick swell near the tip, the small wart-like tissue nodules along the shaft that had no known function. Some scholars today speculate about Peyronie's disease, others suggest a combination of hormonal disorders. Historians still debate whether these medical descriptions were exaggerated by gossip or grounded in rare congenital conditions. But for Maria Antonia, none of that mattered, because she was terrified. Doctors were summoned not to cure, but to mediate. One described the event as less a union of souls and more an attempt at anatomical negotiation. The specially designed cushions were positioned. Maria was given laudanum to calm her. And then, like a queen strapped to history, she was guided through what would become a ritual of physical and emotional horror. There was no romance, no seduction, just pain. And it didn't work. Not the first time. Not the second. Not the 10th. Despite all the preparation, Ferdinand's efforts at consummation were like jamming a misshapen puzzle piece into a space not meant for it. His frustration boiled over. Maria's panic grew. Over the weeks that followed, their marriage settled into a pattern so surreal, it borders on fiction-scheduled attempts at intimacy, assisted by physicians and custom-built equipment, followed by days of silence, morphine, and separation. They lived in the same palace, but like ghosts passing through different wings. Maria Antonia began to unravel. She developed an addiction to laudanum. The drug dulled her body, blunted the fear, made her docile enough to endure the ritual. But it also pulled her deeper into a fog of confusion and despair. She wept often, spoke rarely, and began to believe she was cursed. Ferdinand, meanwhile, grew colder. He saw her terror not as a natural reaction, but as an insult. He believed she was withholding conception out of spite, that her horror was political, not personal. He began to question her loyalty, her faith, her very womanhood. He consulted astrologers, alchemists, charlatans claiming knowledge of Oriental fertility rituals. One mystic, likely a fraud from southern France, convinced Ferdinand that his member was a symbol of divine power, and that with the right chants and incense, it could open the womb of fate. For 3 months, the palace reeked of smoke and superstition. Maria, dosed and silent, was dragged through these ceremonies like a sacrificial lamb. She did become pregnant, twice, and lost both children. The first miscarriage came in the 4th month, the second in the 8th. Doctors blamed her delicate constitution. The unspoken truth her body had endured repeated trauma, not just physical, but emotional, and simply could not carry life. Ferdinand, of course, refused to see it that way. He accused her of treason, of poisoning the pregnancies, of conspiring with liberals to deny him an heir. There is something haunting in the letters Maria wrote during this time. Most were burned, but fragments survive. One reads, "I have done what God and duty ask of me, yet I feel no grace, only fire and fear. I no longer know where I end and the horror begins. She died in 1807 at the age of 21. The cause officially fever and exhaustion. Unofficially, a broken body, a broken mind. Some say she was poisoned. Others think she poisoned herself. Ferdinand grieved in public. In private, he ordered her room sealed. The apothecary who had treated her disappeared mysteriously. The ladies in waiting were scattered to other houses. He said she had failed him, and so Spain prepared for a second queen. But as Maria Antonia's coffin was lowered into the royal crypt, something else lingered in the palace halls. Not just the memory of a girl who had cried for mercy on her wedding night, but the growing realization that the prince who would soon be king carried more than a physical deformity. He carried rot, and it was spreading. The second bride came with the same blind hope, the same glittering procession, the same subtle questions whispered behind fans and lace veils. This time the girl was Isabel of Portugal, another cousin in the endless family tangle of European royalty, and another innocent led toward the golden cage of marriage with a man no one could quite describe without lowering their voice. She was just 19. Bright-eyed, a little nervous, but trained to hide it. Her posture was perfect, her teeth white as sugar cubes. She had read about queens, practiced her signature, smiled at the thought of palace gardens and silver tea services, and then the preparations began. Once again, the special cushions reappeared. The foreign ointments, the quiet doctors with hollow eyes and long instruments who knew exactly what this new queen would be facing, but said nothing. She noticed the way the older ladies in the court wouldn't meet her gaze. She noticed the way the palace servants went quiet when she walked by. No one told her directly what had happened to the first queen, only that she had died young, that she had been sensitive, and then the wedding night came, and the screaming began. Isabel didn't have Maria Antonia's fire. She didn't scream monster or throw herself against the walls. She just froze, stared, and then shook. Her body trembled so violently that the doctors feared she would seize, and Ferdinand, he was already far gone. To him, this wasn't frightening anymore. This was just the routine. He approached her like a surgeon or a scientist. He explained the equipment, the process, the expected order of events. Her silence didn't bother him. Her shaking her wide eyes, her stuttered prayers, none of it fazed him. Because by now, this wasn't about pleasure. It wasn't even about power. It was about function. He needed an heir. She had a womb. The rest to him was just noise. The equipment had improved. Slightly. The new restraints were padded. The oils were more sophisticated. The physicians had better charts. The cushions were embroidered now custom-fitted to the curvature of his grotesque anatomy. But none of that made the experience less horrifying. Isabel endured what her ladies-in-waiting later described as a season of dread. Every few nights the procedure would repeat. A chambermaid would prepare the bed. The physicians would stand by. Isabel would take her draught of laudanum, close her eyes, and hope not to scream. She didn't become addicted the way Maria had. Not outwardly. But she did begin to disappear in other ways. Her ladies noticed she developed a pronounced stutter. She flinched at sudden sounds. She avoided eye contact with the king. When he entered a room, she backed into corners. When he touched her hand in public, she recoiled like he had burned her. They said she was delicate, but it was trauma. Pure, unadorned, palace-wrapped trauma. Ferdinand, of course, took offense. Not pity, not guilt, offense. He accused her of sabotage, said she was making him look weak, that her fear was an insult to his dignity. His paranoia, already bloated from years of whispered laughter, began to swell beyond all proportion. He had her letters intercepted, her food tasted, her servants swapped every few weeks to prevent loyalty. He stopped trusting her glances, her footsteps, her stillness. The palace became a place of surveillance. Ferdinand had peepholes carved into the walls, yes, actual peepholes, so he could watch Isabel when she was alone. Not just to spy on her movements, but to monitor her reactions. He wanted to see if she ever smiled when he wasn't there, if she whispered names in her sleep, if she prayed to be freed. And she did. All of the above. She wrote desperate letters to her family in Portugal. Few made it through. One smuggled by a sympathetic chambermaid reads simply, "It is not marriage. It is not duty. It is punishment. My nights are cold and slick with fear. I wake choking." Historians still debate whether Isabel ever attempted to escape. There's no record of her trying to flee the palace, but there are notes coded cryptic that suggest she once asked a French envoy for asylum. He declined, because Spain needed a queen, and Ferdinand needed an incubator. When Isabel finally collapsed in 1818, the official cause was nervous exhaustion. She was 21 years old. Sound familiar? Her funeral was quieter than Maria Antonia's. By now the public was starting to wonder. Two young queens, both dead before their time, both with empty wombs and tear-streaked diaries. Ferdinand didn't cry at this one. He simply watched as the coffin was lowered into the same crypt, the same shadowed stone. And then he turned and asked for a list of potential third wives. This is the part where most stories would pause, where someone, some priest, some advisor, some brave cousin might step in and say, "Enough." But that's not what happened, because Ferdinand was king now, fully crowned, fully in control. And his need had not diminished. It had multiplied, because every failure, every scream, every miscarriage added to his fury, to his conviction that he had been cheated by fate, that God owed him a child, that Spain could not be saved until he produced a living heir, and if that meant terrifying another woman into silence, so be it. If that meant holding a trembling hand to an ancient cushion while doctors watched through veils of ritual and shame, so be it. Because Ferdinand wasn't just a man anymore. He was a dynasty, and dynasties don't apologize. They repeat. The third marriage was quieter, almost clinical. Less public spectacle, more strategic gamble. Ferdinand, now deep into his 30s, had burned through two young queens and still had no heir. Spain was watching not with hope this time, but with dread. The court was exhausted, the servants jittery. The people, well, they had stopped cheering years ago. This new wife was Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. Older than the previous bride's 24 when she arrived. Not exactly seasoned, but not as naive either. Her family was desperate, her dowry thin, and her future uncertain. A marriage to the King of Spain, even one with a monstrous reputation, was still better than obscurity. She had been warned, quietly, carefully. A physician from Saxony had exchanged letters with Spanish doctors, coded to avoid scandal. She had been told about the anatomical uniqueness. She brought her own doctor, her own medical instruments, her own laudanum just in case, but she also brought something else: detachment. Unlike Maria Antonia or Isabel, Maria Josepha did not come expecting romance. She had no illusions. This wasn't love. This was strategy, a royal duty, a clinical challenge, a marriage performed with surgical gloves, not flowers. When the wedding night came, there was no screaming. There were measurements. She approached the ordeal like a mathematician. What angle? What position? What time of day? Her personal physician kept notes. There were charts, routines, sterilized instruments, and pre-written prescriptions for sedatives. The intimacy became mechanical. The bedchamber a laboratory. It didn't make it any less horrifying, but it made it survivable. For a time, the king did not appreciate her methodical approach. Ferdinand wanted submission, yes, but he also craved emotional validation. He wanted to be feared and desired. And Maria Josepha, with her unblinking eyes and her habit of writing after every attempt at intercourse, unnerved him. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just recorded. The notes disturbed him. He had his spies steal them. He had them translated, read, and summarized. Phrases like severe angulation of the shaft and pressure-induced vascular response made him feel like a specimen on a table. Which, in truth, he was. His paranoia surged. Was she studying him for science, reporting back to Saxony, sharing Spain's shame with foreign courts? He began having her correspondence read, her meals rechecked, her physician interrogated. He accused her of betrayal in the dead of night, barging into her chambers, demanding to know what was written in the little black book. She handed it to him, page after page of dry clinical notes, session timings, positions attempted, discomfort levels, bleeding frequency, emotional distress ratings. He threw it into the fire, and still he returned to her bed. Over and over again. Because despite the resentment, despite the clinical coldness, Maria Josefa's body had not yet failed him. Not completely. There was still hope. Until shockingly, in 1829, 10 years into their mechanical nightmare, she became pregnant. The palace erupted. For the first time in decades, there was genuine celebration. Fireworks, parades, prayers. Ferdinand couldn't believe it. He wept publicly, kissed Maria's hand in court, called her his angel of renewal. And then, as if on cue, the complications began. In her 7th month, Maria Josefa began bleeding. She complained of sharp pains, of pressure, of dreams soaked in blood. The physicians suspected placental abruption, dangerous but survivable with proper care. But this was Ferdinand's palace, and proper care didn't live here anymore. Instead of listening to his doctors, Ferdinand summoned mystics. He had the child's horoscope, charted incense burned in the chambers, talismans placed beneath the pillows. He insisted that holy relics be brought to bless the womb. He banned certain medications as spiritually disruptive. Maria was trapped between science and superstition. She went into labor early. The child, a girl, was born under candlelight and chaos. She lived for only a few hours. Maria Josefa survived the delivery barely, but the infection came fast and the fever faster. 3 weeks later, she was dead. They said it was childbed fever, but everyone knew the truth. It was exhaustion. From the body, from the mind, from a decade of being examined, restrained, repositioned, and never once loved. Ferdinand unraveled. He kept the child's body in his chambers for 2 days, demanding the doctors try harder. He made them attempt resuscitation. He swore he saw her breathe. He brought in a priest to perform a second blessing. The stench became unbearable. When they were finally buried, he ordered that death masks be made of both mother and daughter. He placed them side by side on a velvet altar in his private study. Every day he would speak to them, sometimes lovingly, sometimes accusingly, because even now, with a corpse for a daughter and a queen buried under marble, Ferdinand still believed he had been robbed. Not just by fate, but by women, by wombs that betrayed him, by bloodlines that mocked him. He was in his 40s now, still without an heir, still convinced that his body was a divine gift misunderstood. And Spain was crumbling. The colonies were gone. The economy was wrecked. Revolution whispered in every tavern. But Ferdinand didn't see any of that. He was too busy combing through death records and matchmaking lists. Too busy designing a 4th marriage. He wasn't done. Not yet, because dynasties don't grieve. They try again. This time he didn't even pretend. There were no grand declarations of love, no soft sonnets or staged romantic dinners. The 4th marriage was a negotiation, clinical, quiet, and desperate. Spain needed stability. Ferdinand needed a child. And everyone involved needed it to happen fast. The bride, Maria Cristina, of Naples and Sicily. A distant relative, yes, but more importantly, someone practical, composed, and politically useful. She was 23 when she arrived in Madrid in 1829, escorted by guards, trailed by whispers, and though no one dared say it out loud, already pregnant by another man. Ferdinand knew. Everyone in the palace knew. She was visibly with child. But Ferdinand, broken by failure, twisted by obsession, and hollowed out by grief, chose to believe the lie, or at least pretend to. He told himself this was divine providence, that the timing was miraculous, that finally God had answered his prayers, even if the methods were unorthodox. And when the child was born, a healthy baby girl named Isabella, he beamed. He cradled her with trembling hands, called her his miracle, declared her heir to the Spanish throne. It was all for show, because behind the smiles, the celebrations, the gold-framed portraits of mother and child, Ferdinand was unraveling in new, more disturbing ways. He knew Isabella wasn't his, and it drove him mad. His paranoia, once aimed at courtiers and servants, now turned toward Maria Cristina. He began inspecting her chambers at random hours, bursting in with armed guards, demanding to know who she had written to, spoken to, prayed to. He had peepholes drilled again, this time between their apartments, so he could watch her from the shadows. Not just in moments of intimacy, but when she sat in silence or brushed Isabella's hair or simply sighed. He was watching for betrayal, and saw it everywhere. Maria Cristina adapted quickly. She learned not to react. She moved with studied grace, keeping her emotions flat. Her letters were bland, her prayers loud, her books always state-approved. She understood that Ferdinand was always listening, even when he wasn't in the room. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting learned too, to whisper, to walk softly, to smile on cue. Several developed nervous conditions from the pressure. One suffered a breakdown after being interrogated for speaking too softly near a mirror. Meals became ceremonies of suspicion. Every dish was tasted twice. Servants had to wait 30 minutes after tasting to see if any poisons took effect. Ferdinand sat at the head of the table, watching their faces like a hawk. One poor footman fainted from anxiety, prompting a week-long investigation and a full kitchen purge. Maria Cristina endured it all, but the cracks began to show. She lost weight. Her hair thinned. She trembled sometimes, though she tried to hide it. In secret letters to her family, some of which would later be found hidden behind a false panel in her dressing room, she wrote of living in a glass cage and of feeling like a bird kept alive only to sing a song no one wants to hear. She feared for Isabella, because Ferdinand loved the child, but also resented her. He would stare at her for hours, studying her tiny features, searching for signs of resemblance. Was that nose from his side or hers? The slope of the eyebrow, did it match anyone from the Neapolitan court? He had artists paint detailed portraits of the girl at every age, had them compared to sketches of himself, of Maria Cristina, of her suspected lover. One artist was dismissed after drawing Isabella with blue eyes. Ferdinand's were brown. The king also commissioned genealogists to study Maria Cristina's family tree in microscopic detail. Could any recessive genes explain Isabella's appearance? Could her paternity be proven or disproven by science? The scholars wisely gave ambiguous answers. Yes, they said. Possibly, perhaps. Ferdinand didn't believe them. He began demanding proof of loyalty from the queen. He assigned specific maids to monitor her expressions, had her writing analyzed by a priest-turned-psychologist who claimed that her script showed signs of divided conscience. He grew convinced she was poisoning him slowly through skin contact. Before every attempted intimacy, yes, they still happened. He had her body inspected by physicians. Eyes, mouth, skin, all examined. It was humiliation dressed as precaution. And yet he kept trying, because despite knowing Isabella wasn't his Ferdinand, still wanted his child, a real heir, one with his blood. He believed it was still possible, that with the right alignment of moon cycles, the right mixture of herbs and relics, and the right angle of ritual, his body might still succeed. He commissioned new equipment, new potions, new pillows. His artisans, now masters of their grotesque craft, produced mechanical devices of Baroque complexity. There were belts, levers, weighted pulleys. One device looked more like a harpsichord than anything found in a bedroom. He tested them, all of them. Maria Cristina endured it. Wordlessly, mechanically. She detached herself the way Maria Josepha had done. But Ferdinand noticed the difference. He missed the fear, the submission. Her calm infuriated him. He accused her of mocking him, of pretending to love the child more than him, of smiling too much when he wasn't in the room. She was smiling because she survived the night. Ferdinand in turn stopped sleeping. He became an insomniac, roamed the palace at night, barefoot, muttering to portraits. He would burst into rooms, shouting about conspiracies. He created new passwords for servants daily, sometimes forgetting them himself. He ordered hidden compartments built into furniture. He wrote notes to himself in code and hid them in bread loaves. He demanded that his guards be rotated every 12 hours so none could be bribed. The palace, once a symbol of regal Spanish authority, had become a funhouse of madness. And the king, he was a ghost now. A pale, twitchy, muttering shell of the man who had once been feared. His hands shook. His eyes twitched. He spoke to no one directly, only through his chamberlain, and always in whispers. And still he tried. One more night, one more potion, one more desperate lurch toward destiny. But his body, as grotesque as it was, had finally begun to betray him. The thing that had ruled his life was now a source of pain. It throbbed constantly. The tissue cracked. The veins bulged. The physicians noted signs of necrosis. He refused treatment. He wrapped it in cloth, hid it beneath layers of silk and denial, and kept trying. And when Maria Cristina begged for rest for just 1 month without attempts, he struck her, just once. Open palm, across the cheek. She didn't cry. She just turned away. And he left the room muttering, "You will give me a son." But she never did. By now, Spain was no longer watching with interest. It was watching with clenched teeth. The colonies had broken away. The treasury was leaking silver faster than it could mine it. Bandits roamed the countryside. Revolution flickered in taverns and prayer halls. And at the heart of it all, sitting in a palace draped in candlelight and paranoia, was Ferdinand VII, less a ruler and more a cautionary tale still in motion. His court had become a theater of the absurd. Ministers delivered speeches to empty chairs because the king refused to meet in person. Documents were signed with trembling hands dipped in holy water. Military orders were drafted at 3 a.m., revised again at dawn, and forgotten by noon. Cabinet meetings turned into seances of suspicion. Ferdinand spoke in riddles, tested loyalties by contradiction. Say the wrong thing, treason. Say nothing at all, still treason. He had turned his court into a mirror maze, and nobody could see the exit. And all the while, behind the politics, behind the crumbling walls of empire, his obsession with reproduction continued to rule everything. This wasn't just about children anymore. It was about redemption, about proving that he wasn't broken, that he could still create something, anything, that would outlast him. Historians still debate whether Ferdinand suffered from a rare condition known as macrogenitosomia, a hormonal disorder that can cause abnormally large genitalia accompanied by psychological complications. Others argue it was a unique blend of endocrine and neurological trauma from birth, a cocktail of inbreeding and anatomical misfortune. Whatever the diagnosis, his body had become his curse, and his mind had wrapped around it like ivy on a collapsing wall, and now that mind was slipping. There were days he refused to leave his chambers, convinced that stepping outside would drain the royal essence. He accused servants of stealing his breath. He once ordered the royal laundress flogged because he believed she had cursed his undergarments. When a bishop blessed his bedchamber, he had the carpet removed because he thought it absorbed prayers and turned them against him. He demanded that his mirror be covered when he undressed. He said it stared back. Maria Christina, by this point, had become a kind of warden as much as wife. She controlled access to the king. She filtered his visitors. She played along, nodded at his delusions, and carefully maneuvered around his spirals of madness. But she wasn't free. She couldn't leave, couldn't breathe, couldn't write more than a paragraph in her diary without fearing it would be read aloud in front of the court. She had grown pale, thin, sleepless. Her ladies said she looked like a candle left in a drafty room, always flickering, never quite going out. Ferdinand insisted on nighttime inspections. At random hours, he would burst into her chamber sometimes, with guards, sometimes alone, and demand to know what she was doing. Reading to whom, praying for what? Writing about him. He searched her pillows, her dressing table, her shoes. Once he made her cut open a book to ensure it didn't conceal secret correspondence. It was a Bible, but the king's most obsessive surveillance was reserved for their daughter Isabella. Despite knowing deep down that she wasn't his, Ferdinand clung to her, loved her, feared her, obsessed over her like a broken man cradling a porcelain doll he knows he didn't make, but still believes he can control. He would sit for hours watching her sleep. He would order portraits made weekly, comparing her face to his own. One court artist quit after being forced to repaint Isabella's nose 6 times to look more regal. Ferdinand believed that if he stared long enough, her paternity would reveal itself, that her blood might change, that she might become his. He had genealogists trace every strand of her DNA centuries before such science even existed. They delivered vague assurances, terrified of offending him. One wrote, "The child bears traits compatible with your Majesty's broader lineage." It was nonsense, but it kept them alive, and still Ferdinand tried, despite his advancing age, despite the obvious deterioration of his body, despite the stench of decay that occasionally followed him down the hall. He commissioned one last set of devices, his masterpiece, he called them. They were grotesque, part mechanical, part medicinal. Polished wood steel gears, velvet straps. Devices meant to compensate for the unnatural curvature, to stabilize penetration, to align the act of conception, like celestial spheres clicking into place. The royal craftsman who built them vanished shortly after delivery. Some said he was paid off. Others whispered that he saw something he shouldn't have. In one particularly disturbing episode recorded in the secret journal of a court physician, Ferdinand allowed a group of foreign anatomists to observe him during one of these intimacy procedures. They stood behind a curtain, silent, sketching. The king called it his contribution to science. Maria Christina called it her final straw. After that night, she stopped speaking to him altogether. Not out of defiance, but as self-defense. She became silent, obedient, hollow. Even in public, she said only what was necessary. "Your Majesty, yes, of course. As you wish." Her eyes, once alert, now stared through things. Her fingers trembled constantly. She'd wear gloves even in summer, as if shielding herself from the very air. And Ferdinand, he mistook it for loyalty. He believed she had accepted his greatness. He didn't realize she was surviving him, because by now everyone was. The ministers, the servants, the guards who rotated every shift to avoid corruption. The cooks who pre-tasted food until their mouths went numb. The confessor who listened day after day to increasingly unhinged prayers about fertility, betrayal, and redemption through flesh. Ferdinand's rule had collapsed inward. What had once been a kingdom was now a fortress built to contain his insecurities. Spain no longer mattered. Only legacy did. And so, night after night, the lights in the palace burned long after midnight, the king pacing, the queen lying still, the baby, the not-quite heir, breathing gently in her crib, and outside the empire slipped away, silently, like blood into water. By 1830, there were more rats than ministers in the palace. Dust gathered on legislation. Revolutionaries drank toasts to freedom in candlelit cellars. And Ferdinand VII, the King of Spain, was standing in front of a mirror not to admire his reflection, but to inspect the angle of his left earlobe. He believed it had begun to curl inwards, a sure sign, according to one of his astrologers, that betrayal was near. That was the kind of logic that ruled now. The man who once called himself El Deseado, the desired one, was no longer desired by anyone, not even his own body, not even by his shadow. The thing that had haunted every corner of his adult life, his grotesque anatomy, that misshapen banner of humiliation, was now failing in earnest, inflamed, cracked, discolored, painful, and yet he still believed in it, still treated it like a wounded saint that might perform one final miracle. That belief would destroy what little remained. The palace craftsmen, now used to whispered commissions and blood-soaked upholstery, had developed entire catalogues of marital supports and regal prosthetics. They spoke in euphemisms. They worked in silence. Their chambers smelled of beeswax iron and resignation. They weren't artisans anymore. They were accomplices. One device, later described in a secret letter by a court physician, resembled a miniature siege weapon. It used pressure counterbalance and the weight of the king's own body to maintain functional alignment. It was supposed to neutralize curvature and sustain engagement for no less than 7 minutes. It worked once, sort of. Maria Cristina bled for 3 days. After that, the devices were quietly locked away. The king sulked, the queen prayed, and the silence between them grew thicker than the drapes over their shared bed. By now, Maria Cristina had become something of a specter, drifting from corridor to corridor, trailing whispers and worry. The servants called her La Santa Muda, the silent saint. Her expression never changed. Her voice was soft, careful, measured. Always just enough. Never more. She had to be, because Ferdinand had eyes everywhere. Literally, he had peepholes drilled into every wall that touched her rooms, into her dressing mirror, behind her writing desk, above her bath. He called it the invisible court. He said it was necessary to ensure loyalty, that God had given him the right to see all things. But he wasn't watching for politics. He was watching her hands, her glances, her stillness, and above all, her proximity to Isabella. Because Isabella was now 3 and beginning to speak. Her voice high and cheerful, her curls soft and suspiciously golden. Ferdinand watched her toddle through the palace halls like a ghost he couldn't quite prove was his. He loved her fiercely. He feared her completely. Every time she giggled, he demanded to know why. Was she laughing at him? Every time she cried, he asked if someone had whispered something in her ear. Was she being turned against him? The nurses couldn't keep up. They were rotated monthly. Any sign of attachment was dangerous. One nurse caught comforting Isabella with a lullaby Ferdinand didn't recognize was dismissed and never seen again. Ferdinand began keeping her crib in his chambers. He said it was for safety. He would wake in the night and lean over her, searching her face with a candle held too close. He'd mutter questions she didn't understand. Do you feel like me? Do you see what I see? Are you like me? She once touched his nose and said big, and he didn't speak to her for 3 days. Maria Cristina tried to intervene once. She asked for privacy, for a governess of her choosing, for the chance to raise her daughter without interference. Ferdinand laughed, a strange, high-pitched sound that echoed off the stone walls like a bird in distress. He responded by assigning 3 new guards to Maria Cristina's quarters and ordering her to sleep in the same bed as Isabella, where he could see them both whenever he pleased. The queen's health declined again. Her diaries, which she began writing in code, speak of numbness in her hands, dizziness, frequent nosebleeds, and moments of dissociation. I forget my name sometimes, she wrote. I say it aloud in the mirror, and it feels like someone else's. And the king, he was unraveling, more rapidly than ever. He stopped holding council meetings. He stopped leaving the palace. He stopped dressing fully, sometimes appearing at court in just a nightshirt and one silk slipper, mumbling about betrayal in the mirrors. His ministers began drafting documents without him forging his signature when needed. The machine of the state continued, but the man at its center was no longer driving. He had become the wax figure of a monarch, a trembling candle in a cracked lantern. His obsession with sexual legacy had metastasized. He now believed that Isabella's existence, her laughter, her breath, was a kind of betrayal. Proof that life had moved on without him. That even if she wasn't his, she had still taken the throne meant for his son. A son he never had. A son who never existed. And so he stared at her like she was a ghost of a child he was still waiting to create. He consulted mediums, priests, surgeons. He asked if it were possible to transfer paternity, to sanctify it, to write it into her bones. The answers, polite, evasive, terrified, did nothing to soothe him. At night, he would pace the hallway between Maria Christina's bedchamber and Isabella's crib, whispering fragments of Latin, clutching rosaries, muttering about blood and birthright. Sometimes he would stop and press his ear to the wall, just listening, just waiting. He said he could hear her dreams. He said she was dreaming of someone else, someone real, someone who had actually fathered her. The queen began locking her door, but locks meant nothing, because Ferdinand had the keys, and the eyes, and the need, always the need, because nothing Ferdinand created had ever lasted. Not his marriages, not his alliances, not his political reforms, not even his conquests. All he had left was a child he couldn't prove he'd made, and the terrifying thought that history would remember her, but not him. The irony, of course, was unbearable. Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, Lord of 1,000 velvet rooms, descendant of a bloodline warped by centuries of sacred incest, had finally gotten what he always wanted: a child, a successor, a royal infant to carry on his name, and it wasn't his. At least not in the way he wanted. Not in the way that mattered to him. Because deep down, Ferdinand knew. No matter what the priest said, no matter how many genealogists were bribed or how many portraits were adjusted, Isabella's existence was a reminder not of triumph, but of failure. She had arrived too easily, too smoothly, without screaming or straps or cushions or doctors on standby. She had been born of ordinary sin, not extraordinary suffering, and that to Ferdinand made her foreign, alien, wrong. But he couldn't say that, not aloud, because Spain, broken, brittle, bleeding, Spain needed her. The court needed her. The dynasty needed her. And more than anyone, Maria Christina needed her. So he played along. He held her at public events, let her sit on his lap at Mass, smiled when crowds cheered for the royal family. He even allowed portraits of the three of them together, father, mother, child. A picture of unity, a performance of succession. But behind the smiles there was rot. Isabella's very presence in the palace became a paradox. She was cherished and resented, protected, and watched, hugged, and feared. Ferdinand hovered over her like a man guarding a secret he couldn't forget and couldn't prove. He once asked a court painter to depict her with his jawline. When the man hesitated, Ferdinand ordered his arrest. The painter disappeared. Maria Christina, ever composed, kept her head down. She knew how fragile the arrangement was. She walked like the floor might crack. She spoke like every word had to be translated through mirrors, because she understood what no one dared say out loud. The truth of Isabella's paternity didn't matter anymore. The performance was the thing. The fiction kept the palace standing. But Ferdinand wasn't built for fiction. He wanted facts, proof, certainty. And certainty in a palace built on lies is poison. So he hunted for it, desperately. He demanded reports on every man who had ever come into contact with Maria Cristina before their marriage. Guards, attendants, musicians, priests. One by one they were summoned, questioned, interrogated. Some were tortured, others fled. A few, those most likely innocent, died by suicide. He ordered medical records from Naples, had letters confiscated from foreign embassies. At one point, he attempted to commission a secret anatomical analysis of Isabella's ears, believing they might contain some trace of bloodline. This wasn't science. It was madness in costume, and it only deepened. Because with each failed theory, each collapsed investigation, Ferdinand became more convinced that the truth was being hidden from him. That Maria Cristina, Isabella, the court, even God himself, were conspiring to make him a footnote. He began rewriting palace documents, inserting references to himself as father of the future. He had medallions struck with his face on one side and Isabella's on the other. He instructed poets to write verses connecting her birth to his royal sacrifice. But even poetry couldn't erase biology. And the people began to notice, not in the streets necessarily, but in salons, in private letters, in the quiet disapproval of foreign dignitaries. They saw the king's desperation for what it was. Not paternal love, not dynastic pride, but terror and resentment, because Isabella had succeeded where he had failed. She had captured the hope of a country. She had become a symbol of renewal, of something beyond the twisted corridors of the Bourbon court. And Ferdinand, he was still stuck in the same place alone with his deformity, his rage, and the impossible burden of a child he hadn't truly fathered, but still couldn't let go of. He tried to reclaim control the only way he knew how, by surveillance, by fear, by reducing Isabella's life to another ritual. He demanded daily reports on her meals, her words, her expressions. If she frowned, why? If she cried, who made her? If she asked for her mother, was it a code? He studied her drawings, had her toys searched for hidden compartments. He once confiscated a doll because it had a missing eye. He thought it was a metaphor. The queen, still navigating her glass cage, did what she could to shield her daughter. She scheduled walks in the gardens, surrounded by trusted maids. She whispered lullabies only when the wind was loud enough to cover her voice. She taught Isabella to nod, to smile, to be still, to survive. But even she could feel the weight shifting. Because Ferdinand wasn't just watching anymore. He was slipping, physically, mentally, spiritually. The man who once prowled the palace in silk and suspicion now moved like a scarecrow in robes. His gait uneven, his breath shallow, his skin waxy like someone had tried to preserve him too early. His voice trembled, his hands shook, and his words came out half-finished. He was fading, and he knew it, which made him more dangerous. He began drafting edicts that made no sense, reorganizing ministries that no longer functioned, declaring days of mourning for events that hadn't happened. He spoke of new wars with countries Spain hadn't fought in decades, and always, always he circled back to the same point. Who is she really? The ministers would nod, pretend, smile, but inside they were already preparing for what came next. Because Ferdinand had become a shadow, and shadows only matter until the light moves on. In his final years, Ferdinand VII became less a king and more a phantom haunting his own kingdom. The palace that once echoed with royal procession and political debate now hushed itself into corners, murmuring cautiously behind curtains. Ministers came and went, like ghosts themselves, each fearing they'd be named in one of the king's sudden outbursts, or worse, his long and meandering lists of suspected conspirators. These lists were real, scribbled in the king's own hand, tucked between pages of religious texts and under pillows. Names of courtiers, servants, doctors, cooks, foreign ambassadors. Once you were on the list, you never quite left it. You might still be summoned, still be bowed to, but you were also watched. Always watched. And Ferdinand, he no longer pretended to be sane. He started referring to Isabella as the child with borrowed blood. He told the archbishop that Maria Cristina had cast a spell on him with Neapolitan sorcery and demanded a private exorcism. He insisted the mirrors in the royal bedroom be covered again because they were reporting on him to the French. Even the priests began to avoid him, but Maria Cristina remained, not because she loved him, because she knew the only way to protect Isabella was to play the game until the last piece moved. She didn't plead, didn't resist. She didn't even flinch when Ferdinand took to bursting into her room in the middle of the night, accusing her of poisoning the palace candles or training the baby to smile incorrectly. She had trained herself to sleep lightly, to listen for footsteps, to keep a hand always near her daughter's crib, because Ferdinand's obsession had now fused with his paranoia. He'd become convinced that Isabella's mother was trying to rewrite the prophecy, to use the child to erase him from history. He ordered the royal painter to redo a family portrait because he thought the baby's arm was pointing toward her mother in an accusatory manner. He said it was treason in oil. He demanded that Maria Cristina account for every minute of her day, had her reading choices catalogued, her prayers transcribed. Even her sighs were noted too many, he said indicated secret despair. He hired a new cook every week. He changed guards every night. He stopped eating meat from any animal with feminine features. No lamb, no cow, no hen. Only rooster, he said. Only strength. It wasn't a palace anymore. It was a fortress of mirrors and locks. Ferdinand's physical health was now keeping pace with his mental decay. He developed what the physicians, those who hadn't already resigned, called nervous degeneration. He lost weight. His joints swelled. His skin took on a waxen hue like something already halfway embalmed. He slept rarely, and when he did, he dreamt in shouts, screaming names of people long dead, calling out for wives he'd destroyed, sometimes waking with a start and demanding Isabella be brought to him immediately so he could check her aura. Maria Cristina tried to refuse. He punished her with silence, or surveillance, or both. The queen's health was now faltering too. She had developed a twitch in her right hand, a constant tremble she tried to hide beneath gloves. She rarely ate in public, spoke only when necessary. The servants noted that she would flinch at her own reflection, as if startled to find herself still there. Isabella, now a bright and curious child, was absorbing it all. The silence, the stiffness, the careful steps of her mother, the looming shadow of her father who alternated between calling her angel and stranger. The child had learned to smile on cue, to play only with quiet toys, to never ask questions when the king was in the room. She had also learned heartbreakingly early that hugs could be a form of inspection and lullabies could be recited in code. Ferdinand, even as his organs failed, still clung to control. He revised succession documents weekly, terrified that someone would steal the crown before he died. He began making lists of punishments he wanted enforced. After his death, should anyone speak against his legacy. He once tried to dictate a law requiring the clergy to refer to him during Mass as Ferdinand the Enduring. The bishops refused. He began talking to the portraits. Not metaphorically, literally. He would sit in the royal gallery beneath centuries of family faces and explain his intentions. "You understand, don't you?" he whispered to Charles III. "They think I'm broken. But you know how hard this body fought." He said the paintings blinked when he got it right. The end came quietly and strangely. One night he collapsed while speaking to a visiting cardinal about the betrayal of mirrors. He was helped to bed, and from there he never really rose again. For weeks he faded in and out of consciousness. Sometimes lucid, mostly not. He called out to his first wife, Maria Antonia, asked if the cushions were ready, asked if the baby was crying, asked if the world would finally believe him. The physicians told Maria Cristina that his organs were failing, that he had stopped digesting food, that his muscles were atrophying, that his skin had started breaking down in patches despite their best efforts. She nodded and stayed. In his final hours, he reportedly whispered to a priest, "If only they had understood. If only they had seen what I carried." Whether he meant the country or something else, no one knows. He died on September 29, 1833. The official cause, gout. The unofficial cause, a lifetime of humiliation, obsession, and a body that turned love into theater and power into performance. When King Ferdinand VII died in 1833, the palace did not erupt into grief. There were no public hysterics, no grandiose displays of mourning, no streets lined with weeping peasants clinging to his portrait. Spain had learned to mourn quietly under his rule. Too many had disappeared for sighing too loud. Too many had seen the inside of dungeons for wondering if the king's silence meant more than his words. So when he finally stopped breathing, after months of delusion surveillance and muttered accusations, the corridors of the palace didn't echo with sadness. They exhaled. Ferdinand's body was found in his bed, jaw slack, eyes half open toward a ceiling that had watched decades of torment. His fingers were curled tight, almost protectively, around the corner of his bedsheet. One of the physicians later remarked that he looked more like a child who died from fear than a king who died from illness. The official cause of death was complications from gout, which in the language of royal physicians meant everything failing at once. Liver, kidneys, stomach, mind, all exhausted. Every organ tired of keeping up with the grand performance of a man who had outlived his usefulness. But even in death, Ferdinand left behind one final request, a disturbing one. He wanted his body examined, and not just the usual embalming for royal preservation. No, he left explicit orders for his physicians to study his anatomy in full, specifically his infamous appendage, the one thing he had both loathed and worshipped, the one thing that had defined, haunted, and ultimately ruined every woman who shared a bed with him. It had to be preserved, and so late at night behind locked doors the autopsy began. The royal physicians, most of whom had spent years treating the consequences of Ferdinand's anatomy, gathered in silence. They unwrapped the silk, peeled back the embroidered burial linens, and stared. There it was. Even after death, the king's infamous member remained shockingly intact. Measured at just over 14 inches, the organ's shape confirmed every whispered rumor. The extreme tapering at the base, the bulbous, almost tumor-like swell at the tip, the abnormal curvature slanting left like a bow. And then there were the scars, so many of them. Dozens of jagged marks, some carefully stitched, others roughly cauterized. He had operated on himself. That was the consensus. Over the decades, Ferdinand had attempted again and again to cut, scrape, and alter the very flesh that had made his life miserable. Perhaps in an effort to normalize it, perhaps in shame, or desperation, or punishment. Some wounds had clearly been reopened multiple times. One physician reportedly wept, another simply whispered, "How did he live like this?" Historians still debate what kind of condition Ferdinand suffered from. Some suggest a form of macrogenitosomia, an extremely rare hormonal disorder. Others point to congenital deformities caused by generations of inbreeding. But none of the labels seem to capture the full truth, because this wasn't just a body. It was a symbol, a curse, a metaphor so grotesquely literal that the church demanded it be hidden, and it was. The organ was removed, preserved in alcohol, and sealed in a velvet-lined box. It was sent without fanfare, without record, into the private archives of the Vatican, where it remains to this day. Not because of its size, but because of what it meant. A relic of failure, a symbol of monarchy corrupted by shame, a reminder that absolute power in the hands of a man at war with his own flesh becomes a kingdom ruled by delusion. Maria Cristina, now widowed and newly crowned regent for her daughter Isabella, did not attend the autopsy. She did not weep at the funeral. She did not light candles for the man who had watched her dress from behind spy holes and accused her of sorcery for sleeping too quietly. Instead, she acted. Within days, she had issued decrees to reverse Ferdinand's more absurd policies. She reassigned the guards, closed off the hidden tunnels, quietly burned his surveillance ledgers. She restructured the council, repositioned key allies, and reached out to European powers to reassure them sanity had returned. And then she turned her attention to the child. Isabella II, just 3 years old, was now Queen of Spain in name. Too young to understand what had passed. Too young to grasp the weight suddenly placed on her shoulders. She played with dolls while her mother rewrote the future in ink and silence. But even as Spain took its first uncertain steps away from the paranoia of Ferdinand's reign, the shadows he left behind clung to the velvet curtains and dusty portraits. People whispered about the wives, about the chambers, about the device-filled closets and the cushion-lined horrors, and above all about the child. Was she really his? Did it matter? The church declared her legitimate. The court supported her. And Maria Cristina swore always with steady eyes that Isabella was the true heir. But the rumors outlived the man who caused them. Ferdinand VII was gone, but his story remained. A story not of political genius or grand wars or economic vision, but of a man who could not escape the weight of his own body. A man who built a dynasty on fear and padded headboards. A man whose greatest enemy was the thing he carried between his legs. He had married 4 women, fathered 1 living child, lost an empire, built a bedroom into a laboratory, and died whispering to portraits. When we talk about tyrants, we often imagine great generals or cunning manipulators. But sometimes tyranny arrives not as brilliance but as obsession, not with war or gold or glory, but with anatomy. Ferdinand's Spain was a place of mirrors, straps, whispers, and fear. A country twisted by the shame of its ruler. A nation where intimacy became surveillance, where love became surgery, where failure was embalmed and hidden in the archives of the church. And Isabella, she would reign. She would fight civil wars, face scandals, be deposed, return, and eventually die in exile. But that's another story. Tonight, let this one rest. Close your eyes. Let the palace go dim. The candle has burned low, and the man who could not stop measuring himself has finally been measured by time. He was not great. He was not good. He was unforgettable in all the wrong ways.